You guys can take your seats while the podium comes out. My name's Caleb. I get the opportunity to be the director of middle school and starting in a week high school with my friend Josh Jansen. Now we're gonna get started with our message, and I'm gonna be talking about conviction. Can everyone say conviction? Now, while we get started, what I want you to do is just turn to your neighbor and give them like the first 4 or 5 words that come to your mind when you hear conviction. Go, turn to your neighbor, tell them the first few words that come to mind. All right. Awesome. These are a lot of words. You can turn back. I said 4 or 5. Turn it back here, 4 or 5. Now, while you heard the word conviction, maybe you thought of a great like Law and Order episode where someone's convicted of a crime, or maybe you think of someone almost feeling guilty. They feel convicted, but I'm going to give you a very simple definition. You see, when I was 8 years old, I was at Sunday school, and what happened was my teacher in small groups gave me a shoelace. And we were talking about how the shoelace is such an important part to the shoe. And what we're learning about is standing up, and how conviction means standing up for what's right, even when others don't. Now, 8-year-old me was so excited because it made so much sense. That week, I was going to stand up for what's right. I was going to wear my shoelace around the ankle, and there's a picture up of me there. I kept this shoelace around my ankle for so long that it got so gross, but every time I looked at it, it reminded me of the simple definition of conviction means standing up for what's right, even when others don't. Now, it was very simple, but then I began to grow up and realized it's not that easy. You see, as we grow older, we begin to not notice that there's a difference between preference and there's a difference between conviction. You see, conviction defines who we are, while preferences define what we like. Convictions are immovable and they never change, while preferences come and go and are always changing. A conviction means that you have a belief that's so strong that you're so thoroughly convinced that you take a truth and you make it your absolute truth that you're willing to defend to the death of you. While a preference is a strong belief that's going to change. And conviction are solid straight lines that you're not willing to cross, while a preference are lines that you draw with pencil. That you're willing to erase and nudge it a little bit and keep nudging it and keep nudging it. But what happens if we constantly get our convictions and our preferences mixed up? You see, if we live our lives thinking our preferences are convictions, what happens? It's like weeds that begin to grow over the lines where we actually need them to be more visible for our life. If you played soccer, it's like when the grass begins to grow over the out-of-bounds lines, and you start playing soccer and kicking the ball, and before you realize, you're so far out of bounds that you've been playing soccer for too long, not on the field. This is what happens when we mistake preferences and convictions. If we live our lives purely by the pencil lines of preferences, then the second we're faced with a consequence or something that makes us uncomfortable, we're going to be willing just to erase that line and move it 3 feet to the left. Erase it, move it 3 feet to the left. Before we realize it, we're so far down a path that we wonder how we got here in our finances, in our relationships, in our life. That's what happens when we make this mistake. A life lived by convictions that are actually preferences causes someone to be unpredictable, inconsistent, and what it does is it actually confuses and dilutes what Jesus is trying to do through you and influence the world around you. So how can you and I know if our convictions are actually convictions or if they're preferences? There's 3 questions. Everyone say 3 questions. Question number 1, is your conviction dependent on those around you supporting you? Are you going to raise your hand, or does someone first need to raise their hands in worship before you will? Because if that's the reality, then it's actually a preference. Because convictions say, I'll lead the way. Preferences say, who am I going to follow? Question 2, are you willing to stick to your convictions even if it means not everyone's going to like you? Because the reality is when we stand up for what's right, even when others don't, not everyone's going to like it. And if likability is a weighted factor to your convictions, then they're actually called preferences, not convictions. Question 3, if no one is around you, will you stick to your convictions? If you knew that you could cheat on your taxes and no one would ever know, would you still do it? Because the reality is that we will do anything. If you do everything wholeheartedly and know that God's the only one who's going to see it, will you still do things wholeheartedly? Or will you only use half your heart knowing that no one's going to be there to cheer you on? That the only crown and present and gift you're going to get is when you get to heaven and God says, you did good, my servant. That's when it's a conviction. Convictions are a part of you that you can't get rid of. Convictions are what you do when no one is there to cheer you on. Now, in order to understand how weighted convictions really are, we're going to follow a story of 3 men in the Bible. Now, these 3 names have thrown me off for the last 19 years. I've been practicing all week. Here we go. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here we go. Now, this story is set in Babylon, a nation ruled by a king named Nebuchadnezzar. Now, this king was mean, he was rude, and he took pride in torturing victims. Now, the people of Israel, the people of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were overthrown and taken into exile into Babylon. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he constructed this large statue and forced everyone to worship it at the sound of the flutes and the instruments. Now, we can see in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, 6 through 7, it says, and I'm going to read it quickly, whoever doesn't bow down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. And as soon as they heard the sounds of ram horns, flutes, lyres, harps, and 3-stringed harps, and all other kinds of instruments, all the people of every province, nation, language bowed down and worshipped the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And here stands Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 10 commandments say they shall worship no other gods except for the one true God. So in the midst of this chaos, they weren't in Israel. They were in a pagan nation of pagan gods with a king who has been described as the ancient version of Adolf Hitler for how cruel and mean he was. And what did they do? They didn't bow down. They stayed standing. And Nebuchadnezzar instructed his soldiers after this to prepare the furnace, to make it 7 times hotter. And what had happened, the men tending to the fire ended up dying because of the heat. And he turned to these 3 men and said, okay, now bow down for my statue. And yet they still said no. Everyone else bowed. Everyone bowed down in fear. So what made them choose death over going into the furnace? Or death instead of bowing down? You see, in order to understand their choice to stand in their convictions, we actually need to go to the beginning of their narrative, to go to the beginning when they went to Babylon. You see, at the beginning, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, their friend, were selected from a large crowd to be in the king's court. The king would overfeed the people in the royal court because being obese and fat was a sign of prosperity, so he would try and force food on them. But the issue with this food is that it was first offered to the pagan god Marduk of Babylon. Now, the king was trying to turn Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel into the Babylonians. Now, they might have been forced into the Babylonian culture, but what they did have that they didn't was that they had carried the word of God on their heart from the beginning of time. And the law that was given to Moses said and prohibited to eat any food offered to other gods. So they had to make a decision. Were they going to eat the food or not? Now, what we might not realize is we can see this as so trivial and so quick. Just don't eat the food and keep going. But what you don't realize is how lucky they got. Every single person that they knew was standing outside of the palace, was standing outside of the king's court, was being forced into slavery and working day and night. They were lucky. And if they didn't eat the food, they were potentially risking their place of privilege in the king's court. So what did they do? They refused the food, but they convinced one of the king's guard to say, give us 10 days. Just give us fruits and vegetables, and we'll prove to you that we can survive on just fruits and vegetables and we'll be as strong. And they knew that if fruits and vegetables did not suffice, then they were going to be thrown out into slavery like everyone that they knew. Now, in life, we have to make millions of decisions. And most of them are quick, and they're in the moment. Of these decisions, we have to say yes to things or we have to say no to things. Now, we can be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who stood in front of that burning fire, that burning furnace, and said no to bowing down. And it wasn't because it was a cognitive decision in the moment. It was actually them acting off the muscle memory impulse of conviction that they had sitting around that table saying no to the food. You see, we are going to have to make so many decisions. We're going to have so many opportunities to slip up. And we can stare mistakes in the eyes and actually not realize they're the mistakes. And what's not going to protect us is sitting down and overanalyzing and thinking about it. What's actually going to protect us from saying no to the correct things and yes to the correct things is building our muscle memory of having convictions in even the small things. Because when we get to those big things, having the muscle memory impulse of conviction is what's going to actually help us to say yes and no to the right things. Because if you don't develop your convictions before, you're not going to develop them in the moment. People with convictions draw lines in their heart that they're not willing to cross ahead of time, not in the moment. So what stops you and I from having strong convictions? Is the potential loss of a friendship, relationship, likability causing you to give in to convictions? Is it letting you live your life by the penciled lines of preference that you're willing just to keep moving around so you never have to come face to face with a consequence or an uncomfortable situation? Are you scared you're going to lose something? Because let me show you what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to gain. If we go to the beginning of the story of them refusing food that was offered to the idols, in Daniel, the book of Daniel 1:18, we can see that after the 10 days, they were inspected. And they were inspected for their health, and what they realized is that Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and their friend Daniel were more well-nourished, were stronger and healthier than all the ones that ate the food that was offered to the idols. You see, God honored their strong convictions by keeping them and sustaining them and making them healthy. Now let's jump forward to the story of the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the convictions got them thrown into the furnace. It burned anyone who was tending to it even close, and here they are tied up, thrown into the furnace, but we can read what happens. It says, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Did we not tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they responded. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men. I see 4 men unbound, walking around in fire unharmed, and the 4th one looks like a god." You see, what happened was when they were willing to risk everything for their convictions, it was actually the moment that they had the closest encounter with God. It was the most intimate moment they had when they weren't willing to live their life by penciled lines of preference, instead sharpied lines of convictions because they knew right from wrong. They had built the muscle memory impulse of conviction sitting around that table, and God honored it. Now maybe you're sitting there and you're going, well, if I was called into the king's court, I'd have convictions. If I knew that I was going to have that 4th man standing in the fire with me, I would have those strong convictions. But let's change the story quickly. What if I told you that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fire and they died? Does that change everything for you? Does it change? Should they have bowed instead? Or are we focusing too much on the earthly aspect of it? Because if we're only looking at the earthly angle, then what happens is we don't realize that there's actually a reward waiting for them somewhere else. Let us never look for good outcomes, because when we stand in our convictions, it honors God. And God honors us, but sometimes it looks a little bit different than we see here. And that can't be the determining factor if we live our life by the Sharpie lines of conviction or the penciled lines of preference. And God honors us, but is your crown waiting in heaven going to be enough for you to stick to your convictions? So what does it look like to live only by the fickle preferences of penciled lines? What are you potentially risking? You see, our convictions are a testimony of the God we serve. And it causes people to actually stop in their path and take notice of what it looks like to live a life full of convictions that honors and glorifies God. But a life of preference, it'll leave you popular, it'll leave you well-liked, but those 2 things die with you. When we choose to live a life full of conviction, we live a life that is a testimony to the God we serve. We influence and change the world around us, and do you know what that does? That stays after on earth when we die. That continues to impact generations and churches that know we serve a God that honors and glorifies and blesses our lives. So what do you need to say no to? What do you need to actually realize that's a line drawn with pencil, and I need to take a Sharpie and make it a little bit more definite in my life? I can't keep erasing that because I'm going to keep looking back and wonder how I got here. What do you need to draw a line in your heart ahead of time now for the moment that you get into that place? Because you can't actually prepare your convictions in the moment. You've got to do it before. You've got to build that muscle memory of conviction now before you get there and make the wrong choice. Now, I want to leave you with a verse, and it's of the story of Eli, who watched his son let their convictions become preferences, and he stood by watching. And we can look at God's response in 1 Samuel chapter 2:30. It's going to be on the screen behind me. It says, "But I will honor those who honor me, and I will despise those who think lightly of me." Now, if you remember at the beginning, I talked about the shoelace, and surprisingly enough, I don't know why, it's kind of gross, but my mom kept it. And this is disgusting. But what this shows is if you can see all the knots that are tied, as an 8-year-old, I refused to let go of the reminder of to stand up for what's right. I tied it over and over and over again so I never lost it. Now, I don't know about you, but I want to be a people that says, God, you know what? I was willing to do whatever it took to hold on my convictions. I was willing to do whatever it took to live my life full of conviction so that I honor my God, that my life is a testimony to the gospel of Jesus because I want to influence the world around you. So I'm going to do anything it takes to hold on to my convictions because when we hold on to our convictions, it honors God and God honors us.
Come on, let's hear it for Caleb. I swear, you got, so Caleb's one of my best friends, and I surround myself with people that are just geniuses. And the kid, if you ever talk to Caleb, even if he doesn't know what the subject is about, when you're done, you think he's an expert in the subject. It's like the kid is an absolute genius. And one of my best friends, I love building ministry with you. My name is Josh. I am the kids pastor at the Chariots campus, and Caleb and I are going to build an awesome youth ministry together. So we're really excited. It's going to be fun. Pierre Marlise, thanks. This is great. You've actually given my family a home church. It's just so awesome. You should, the way I have a 3-year-old son at home, who I'm going to talk about in a second, and the way he talks about this place, you would think he literally lives here. He walks around, if you come to Chai, he's the 3-year-old walking around like he owns the place, so it's fun. My family loves it here. So I'm going to open up by reading a verse for you. It says in Psalm 20, verse 7, David opens this by saying, "Now this I know, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God." I want to speak my title, if you're into titles, is "You Won't Find It in the Chariots." You won't find it in the chariots. So like I said, I've got a 3-year-old at home, and if you know anything about me, I tend to be a bit high-strung. So I kind of wear my emotions on my sleeve. If I'm upset, I can't compartmentalize. If I'm embarrassed, I can't compartmentalize. And if I'm angry, I can't handle it. So we've got this thing where we're going to go out, and Wes needs to get his shoes on. So I sit him down. I'm like, "Okay, Wes, we're going to get your shoes on." He says, "No, Mommy, do it." And that's cool. I get it. He wants to control things. So I'm, "No, Daddy's going to do it." "No, Mommy, do it." And it was after the 78th time that you've been through this, you tend to get really upset. And so finally the force of will takes over, and I get the shoes on my son. And he's he is screaming to the point where now he's running down his hallway and he slams his door. And he's 3, I'm 30, okay? And I'll yell back. I'm like, "Dude, what are you even doing?" These are my conversations with my son. Now I'm so mad that I can't go chase after him because then it's bad and you get in trouble. So I have to go to the living room, and I'm pacing now. And I don't do morning declarations until I'm mad at my son. I'm letting myself know you are anointed, you are talented, you are a good dad. I'm talking to myself. And then this happens. This happened the other day. It was negative 18 degrees. We wanted to go to the museum. So then my wife comes down. Esther comes down. She's like, "What are you doing? You completely lost control." I was like, "He's the one who's out of control." And so, but it's funny. It's funny. But have you noticed how much of your life is outside of your control? Think about it. Have you noticed that you're going to be having the most splendid month of the year? This could be it. You could be thinking, my life literally could not be better than this moment. Everything is, I'm getting the promotions I wanted. I've got the job of my dreams. My wife, it's a miracle what's happening. My kids are beautiful and healthy. Everything, my cars aren't breaking down for the first time in 10 years. And then all at once, bad news hits your inbox like a freight train. And you have no idea which way is up. And it's bound to happen. It's bound to happen. I know it's encouraging, but eventually bad news is coming. Eventually a bad season is coming. And what's interesting, you have to ask yourself, how often do I allow the bad seasons of my life to dictate my satisfaction? Like, how often am I allowing my dissatisfaction to dictate my life? Because here's the deal. I do not think that bad seasons or distress are the plate of the church. In fact, if you look at church history, it is full of seasons of distress. In fact, it's been much worse than it is right now. What I think is the epidemic that will wreak havoc on a church is a group of people who live life without conviction. I think the opposite of conviction is apathy. And I'm young, but I have seen the power of apathy. You can see it. It's always there, but when distress hits, it's like a magnifying glass to apathy. All of a sudden, passion has waned, emotions have gone awry, your sense of courage to attack life is just completely gone. Apathy has taken over. And I promise you, there's nothing that's wreaking havoc on the church like apathy. And in fact, where there's no conviction, your life is a slave to apathy. It's a slave to it. It has no other choice. If you do not have convictions, your life is a slave to apathy. Which is why I actually love how David opens up this letter in Psalms, this song in the book of Psalms. Because he doesn't open with the verse I just read. He opens with distress. It's actually interesting because he actually opens his song in a place where humanity can relate. They say misery loves company. So he opens his letter with distress. He says this in verse 1. He says, "May the Lord answer you when you are in distress. May the name of God of Jacob protect you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and grant you support from Zion. May he remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings." Then he writes Selah. And then in verse 4 he says, "May he give you the desire of your heart and make all your plans succeed." Like, don't you just want to jump to verse 4? You just want to make your home in verse 4. I know my desires. I know my heart. Let's just give them to me. I want them and I want them now. I joined this thing so I can just rub my magic Jesus lamp and he can grant me my wishes and I'll get what I want. That's why I signed up for what I signed up for. But before David gets to the desires of your heart, he puts this little word Selah. And now scholars will argue night and day about what Selah actually means, but most agree that it's an intentional break in the song. It's an intentional rest in the music. In fact, you might even call it an intentional time to reflect. You see, what happens is when the going gets tough, our gut reaction is, I just got to push a little harder. I can't relax. I got to put my head down. I got to grind. I'm sorry, babe. I got to put 70 hours in this week because I'm in a bad season. I've just got to grind. Sorry, kids. I can't come home tonight. I have got to grind. And what actually is interesting is sometimes you just need to pause. A lot can be said about the pause. In fact, it's in the pause between your distress and your desires that your convictions are tested. The pause between your distress and your desires is where your convictions are tested. Think about David, the guy who wrote this song. David's anointed king, and now he's working for the guy he's taking over for, and that guy wants to kill him. Now, if I'm David and my boss is trying to kill me, I'm just saying to myself, you know what? I don't need to do this. I don't need this. I had it made at home. I was a great shepherd. I was fighting bears and lions. That was bad enough, and I was really good at it. I don't need this. I was probably going to take over my dad's estate. It was comfortable. I knew what was coming next. I was fine. But David didn't live by chariots. Instead of doing that, he wrote this psalm. Even in my distress, I don't trust in chariots. I trust in the name of the Lord my God. And you take the guy who was trying to kill him, Saul. What did Saul do? Saul gathered as many chariots as he could muster. The strongest men in his army, he got together. Now, logic would gather chariots. Logic would say, you know what? I need to find a new job. Logic would say, you know what? I need to leave my spouse. Logic would say, you know what? My church has hurt me too many times. I got to get out of here. Logic will make you gather your chariots. But convictions, they tell you to trust in the Lord. Convictions tell you to hide in the cave. Convictions tell you to pause and wait for God's response. That's what convictions tell you. You see, the question you have to ask, because David, after he does his pause, he said, I'm going to give you the desires of your heart. The question is, what is your heart aligning to? Because what is going to happen is your heart's going to align to your convictions in the midst of the pause. So you have to ask yourself, what is my heart aligning to? You see, your heart's an interesting thing. Your heart, that's where your appetites for life, that's where they reside. They're in your heart. Your passion, your zeal for living, it's in your heart. Your sense of courage, that's in your heart. So when you hit distress, you're going to find very quickly what is sitting in your heart. Has your passion for life waned? You have a conviction problem. Has your zeal for God's house waned? You might have a conviction problem. And then the really crazy one, has your courage dissipated? Because here's what you'll hear from people. You'll be going through a tough season, and they'll say, listen, God's not going to give you more than you can handle. I personally don't buy it. Because here's the deal. I think that God works in the presuppositions that you're going to rely on him when life gets impossible. Okay? I actually believe that if you could handle this thing called life on your own, you would not need a savior. In fact, if you could save your life by your own devices, you would be a God. Like we desperately need to understand that it takes great courage to do this thing called church. To wake up every day when life is not making sense and say, you know what, I'm going to trust in the name of the Lord. That's illogical, it doesn't make much sense, and it takes great courage. And I'm telling you what, God wants to do great things in a church that says, you know what, I don't understand it, but I'm just going to choose courage today. Crazy things can happen like that. So my question for you is, how does your heart look? Is your seat occupied by the things that you can control? Has your job become the most important thing about you? Has the ministry you served in become more important than the church? Have you married your ministry and you're dating the church? It's a scary place to be. Has your relationships taken the seat in your heart? It's actually interesting when it comes to, I love couples that are dating. It's actually interesting how quickly we go from love to idolizing. It's like a snap of a finger. All of a sudden, your entire self-worth is coming from the person who has stolen your heart. And unfortunately, they've become a god. What is taking your seat? See, all these things that you can control are chariots. And the moment that we make this thing about chariots, we're doomed for failure. But this is a conviction I know to be true. When I am in distress, I can trust that Jesus is going to see me through. I mean, the devil, he might want to come for my job, but I know who's in the seat of my heart. See, he might try to attack my marriage, but I know who's sitting in my heart. He might try to attack my family, but I know beyond a shadow of a doubt who's in my heart. He might try to come after my loneliness, but I know who's in my heart. He might try to get me depressed, but I know who's in my heart. He might try to get you discouraged. He might try to get you disappointed, but you know who's in your heart. A life of conviction knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can trust in the name of the Lord. You see, scriptures are peppered. They're peppered with men and women who live their lives with saying to themselves, some are going to trust in chariots. Some are going to trust in horses. But we're going to trust in the name of the Lord. It's peppered. You can't even turn a page of the Bible without finding an ordinary individual who said, you know what, I'm just going to go for this thing. I'm going to trust that God's got my back. And none more than Jesus. Think about this. This guy has felt our pain to the nth degree. You see, Jesus himself knows what it's like to lose a best friend. He was there at Lazarus' tomb when Lazarus was already dead. He looks around and Mary and Martha, they're weeping. He feels the pain of losing a best friend. They say that Jesus' family thought he was crazy. He knows what it's like to be estranged from a family. Jesus knows. He knows what it's like to look into a father's eyes whose daughter's dying and feel the pain of a father who's losing everything, and he gets it. He knows what it's like to be in the last moments of his life and watch every single friend that he thought he had leave him. He knows what it's like. And to make it even crazier, the man knows what it's like to feel the sting of death. And through it all, he says to God, not my will, but yours be done. He basically says like David, some are going to trust in chariots, some in horses, but God, not my will. Yours be done. Now I'm wondering, in the midst of the distress that you find yourself in, where do your convictions lie? In the midst of the season that you find yourself in, may it be said of the Father's house, that whether come hell or high water, because unfortunately, we know it's coming, we chose not to trust in chariots. We chose not to put our heads down and grind, But we said when people look at us, they're going to think that we are the crazy ones. When people look at us, they're going to say, this is illogical. It doesn't make sense. Do you hear about what they're going through? Do you hear about what's going on? It doesn't make sense. But we trust in the name of the Lord. Thanks.